So let me introduce Irissa. She is a graduate student in the sociology department. I think she's completed or is nearing completion of the ICS certificate. She's taken lots of classes and learned lots of great things, and she's pursuing a bunch of interesting research that I'm very excited about. So one of those projects you'll hear about today, which is actually a project that was completed, or so we thought, in 2018, but we're still developing it, and we have 3 new years of data and a lot of new ideas that we're going to develop into 2 papers instead of 1. So any feedback you guys have on that today is appreciated. But she's also doing really exciting stuff using computational social science methods to do analysis at scale and in real time on a bunch of different things, including Twitch and Twitter. So that's all the introduction I'll give today, and I'll let Irissa take it away from there.
All right, and let me just say, I told Jason not to worry about the graph if the graph was too much. So Jason did not disappoint me on that front.
Yeah, what happened was I fell asleep before the kids, and then I woke up at 7 a.m. and I had meetings this morning. So someday we'll have up to the date data on this, and there will be a streaming process, and it just runs out of the computer. But maybe that's on your future directions slide today.
Yeah. So again, like Jason mentioned, this has been a project that we've been working on for a while. It's been kind of going through peer review for a while, and we actually just got our most recent round of reviews back. So any feedback you have would be really helpful for that, like Jason mentioned. And I think I can share my screen. Here we go. All right, can everybody see that? Just shout at me if you can see it. Okay.
Yep, we see it.
Great. I have never, despite using Zoom for a long time now, I have not mastered the art of, managing both of my screens. So, whoops. All right. There we go. Okay, so again, like Jason said, this is a project that focuses on Twitter, right? Focuses on studying a very, very large sample of Twitter users. And our work is really focused on how people are labeling themselves online. And so really, right, just I'm not going to talk too much about background here just because there's been so much work done on kind of the way in which identity and self-expression online happens, the way it's changed over time, and the different ways in which people are present themselves in digital spaces. But just to give kind of a very, very brief overview of the background, right? We know that people are in general very careful and very intentional about the way that they present themselves online, right? They pick and choose which aspects of themselves to put forward to the public and which aspects of themselves to not put on their Twitter profile, for example. And these are also, very strategic decisions, right? Because in many cases, when you are presenting a version of yourself to the public, right, you want to present your ideal self, right? You want to put your best foot forward, so to speak, and you want people to see a version of you that is, socially desirable, to use that term. Right, and for the sociologists in the room, what we get right, we know that this has been a popular perspective in sociology for a long time, right? We can think about Goffman's work on how people treat identity as a performance, right? People are always performing to the public and to other people whenever they present themselves and whenever they interact with others. And this definitely extends to online spaces, right? For example, if you're going to have a very different version of yourself on your LinkedIn profile versus on a Twitter profile that you essentially just use for posting memes that you find funny and you don't necessarily associate with your work life, just to give an example. And really, right, we know that these decisions are strategic and they're often a continuous process, right? And you're often very intentional about picking and choosing based on the context and based on the time period what things to put in your Twitter bio and what things to leave out. Right. So if I am very into sports at the moment, I might change my Twitter bio to say, I'm an Islanders fan, I'm a Nets fan. If I'm less happy about how the season's going, or if I'm less thrilled with a decision that the team made, I might take that out of my profile. That might be kind of a bad example, but just, that's one way that might work. And to raise the stakes a little bit, and what our project really focuses on is how these decisions come into play when you are talking about someone who holds a marginalized identity or belongs to a group that is very heavily stigmatized, right? If you belong to a group where putting your identity in public, right, or acknowledging your identity in public might not necessarily be a safe thing for you to do. Or might open you up to harassment, backlash, things of that nature. Especially in the online world where we know that, harassment and violence can be really public and really, really powerful and really hurtful for many individuals. And so our project focuses on LGBTQ individuals online, specifically on Twitter. And just again, to go over just very briefly, this is by no means extensive. This is just very, very surface level because I want to get to, the meat of this. But we know that, disclosure, like being able to say very publicly that you are queer, being able to show that identity, be proud of that identity, does have really positive effects on the well-being of queer individuals. But, as I mentioned, there's also a lot of stigma potentially associated with, acknowledging that you are queer online. And deciding whether or not to do this may be, really a difficult decision for you. It might be motivated by concerns for your safety. What happens if my mother sees my homophobic mother sees my Twitter profile and finds out that I'm gay, things of that nature. And, we know that this operates in other contexts, right? We know there's been some work done on individuals, just off the top of my head, I remember there's been some work done on individuals who have disclosed the fact that they have had miscarriages online. And we know that that disclosure can be very hard for people. And also part of what is relevant to this work is also that, seeing other individuals disclose this fact online and being very open and public about this can lead more people to, feel safer coming forward about something that has a lot of stigma potentially associated with it. So that's kind of what we're trying to capture with this project. And one term that has been used for this sort of thing is known as a chilling effect, right? So the chilling effect is actually a term that comes from legal scholarship and is really associated with the idea that people limit online behavior. So people choose not to do something online out of fear that it's going to have some sort of offline consequence for them. So Penny in 2016, I believe that work was focused on Wikipedia articles, right? And focused on people who were not accessing certain information online out of some fear that they would be flagged by, I believe it was the NSA, or though I might be remembering that incorrectly. But so there is this concept that people might limit their behavior online for, because they think that there's going to be something that happens to them because of that. And in the context for queer individuals, right, you might think that someone would choose not to label themselves as LGBTQ online out of fear of, family seeing that information, friends seeing that information, people they don't necessarily want to know that they are queer, potentially seeing their very public Twitter profile and, and then they have to deal with some sort of backlash because of that. So really, this project, we had two primary questions going into this project. which are kind of twofold here, right? First of all, we really wanted to know, is the act of labeling oneself as queer, right, including one's queer identity in one's Twitter profile, becoming more common, right? Are people increasingly starting to do this, right? Are people starting to feel more comfortable identifying themselves in this way online, and specifically on Twitter? And secondarily, dealing with this concept of the chilling effect, right? We were really interested in looking at whether there are particular societal factors or societal events that are relevant to queer individuals, both in a positive and a negative way, that is influencing people's decisions to really include these words in their profile. So are people making decisions to add a label to their profile in response to something positive, or remove a label from their profile in response to something negative that might cause them to fear for their safety? So, we are studying Twitter data, and we used a lot of very computationally heavy methods to do this. But essentially what we're doing is fairly simple. We are measuring the presence of words in people's Twitter biographies. And we are specifically looking at American users who are tweeting in English, right? And our data comes from the data that I'm going to talk about in this presentation, although Jason mentioned we have more recent data now, but the data we use in this paper comes from 2015 to 2018. And so essentially what we are doing, right, is we're looking at people's Twitter biographies for the presence or absence of specific keywords, right? So gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer are the 5 that we focus on here, although there are many others that we are continuing to look at and have looked at. We are, experimenting with various abbreviations and different, different combinations of words to kind of go more in depth on this. But the data that I'm going to talk about here specifically focuses on those few words. And so we essentially have 2 different samples of individuals that we looked at. So on the one hand, we have a longitudinal sample, and this is where we observe the same group of Twitter users over time. So that contains about 3.5 million people. And those are individuals where we have a snapshot of your Twitter bio at least once every year from 2015 to 2018. So these are, again, the same individuals where we can track their changes in their Twitter profile over time. And then we have a much larger cross-sectional sample. So these are people who we're not necessarily observing the same sample of individuals over time, but these are individuals that are captured, at varying points in time, usually only once, and that sample contains about 20 million users. So one is a little bit smaller, but we get to see really the same individuals across time. So we get a better estimate of longitudinal change, and then one that's a lot bigger where we get cross-sectional change. Sorry, I didn't caffeinate this morning, so I'm like trying to sip some caffeine while I do this. And so the way that we do this, right, we're using regular expressions to match these patterns of words. So we're not capturing, extraneous words, for example, like the word bi, right? We're not capturing like bilingual or bicycle, for example. So we are specifically looking for that pattern of words. And again, the keywords that we focus on specifically for this talk, or the keywords that most of our data or most of the figures that I'm going to show you are based on are these 5 keywords, which are lesbian, gay, bi, and trans, and queer. And bi and trans, we also have bisexual and transgender, the full versions of those words as well. And so what we're doing is we're measuring prevalence, right? We're measuring the number of accounts that contain these labels in their profile. And very kind of important to mention is we're counting accounts here. We're not counting words. Well, we are counting words, but essentially, right, if you use the same word multiple times, that account is not going to be captured twice. So if someone has the keyword gay in their profile 5 times, that's not going to count 5 times in our sample. That's still going to count as one account. And so essentially what we're doing to kind of get at when people are taking these words out or putting these words in their profile, we're measuring what we're calling add and delete events. So, kind of intuitively speaking, an add event is when, keyword appears in someone's bio where it was not there previously. Someone edited their profile to put that word in. And when we see a delete event, right, this is when we see a keyword no longer appears where before it did appear. Right, so someone has made the decision to edit their profile and remove that word. How am I doing on time? Oh, wow, I've been talking for a while. I want to get at the meat of this, right? So again, we're using Twitter, right? Twitter has become a really popular data set to use in the social sciences, right? It's one of the most popular social media sites in the world. Specifically in the US, it's used by about 22% of American adults, according to the most recent estimates from Pew. I forgot to put the source in on the slide, but that's where that number comes from. It's from Pew Research from, I believe, 2019. And we also know that, right, Twitter as a website and as a platform has really become the center of a lot of very culturally relevant movements and pop culture trends, that sort of thing over time. And it's really become very relevant to social life since the site began back in 2006. And the advantage of Twitter from a data perspective, right, is that it allows us, we can really study samples of millions of individuals, right, millions of tweets, profiles, millions of people in a relatively simple way that's pretty cost effective, right? We don't necessarily have to spend thousands of dollars to go out and give a survey to, 3,000 people when we can get samples of millions relatively easily. And the advantage of looking at Twitter biographies, right, since most work on Twitter usually looks at tweets instead of biographies, right, is that even though people tweet fairly often, right, I probably tweet like 5 or 6 times a day, but really our Twitter profiles tend to be a lot more static than that. People tend to edit their Twitter profiles a lot less than they tweet. Right, you can kind of think of Twitter as being your your tweets as being your random stray thoughts, right? But your bio is a much more static version of yourself. And in our data specifically, we really see that only about 52% of users even make any changes to their Twitter profile in a given year. And 88% of users in our sample edited their bio at least once between 2015 and 2020. So that means essentially 12% of our sample is not editing their bio at all in 5 years. So it's really a fairly static measurement of yourself and how you choose to present yourself online. And so again, there are a couple of limitations here, and I'll be interested to hear what some of you have to say, because this has been a sticking point with this project for some reviewers, right? Is that we know that Twitter, not everybody on Twitter is a human. We know this. There are some bots on Twitter, which are robots that are disguised as real people, tweeting as real people. There's also potentially sock puppets, which if you're not familiar with the term sock puppet, it really just means one individual is operating multiple Twitter accounts, right? So if a person has 5 or 6 Twitter accounts, that sort of thing. And so really, my and Jason's response to that, and our response in the past has been that, bots tweet frequently, but when you see a bot, right, we are looking at a Twitter profile, not necessarily what that bot might potentially be tweeting. And to me and to us, it's really unlikely that a bot would choose to edit, or the individual who's maintaining that bot would choose to edit that bot's profile in this kind of way, right, to reflect these words. And also, right, if a bot exists, the profile of that bot is likely to remain pretty static, just, in the same way that a user would, if the bot even has a bio at all, right? Most bots that I've seen on Twitter, or most sock puppet accounts that I've seen on Twitter, don't even necessarily fill out the bio field. So in our mind, right, we are, and we're working on some validity numbers right now to kind of verify exactly how likely this is to happen. So we're still working on that sort of validity check. We don't have those numbers yet, but we will for the next round of this paper. And in terms of sock puppets, right, we know that Twitter accounts aren't necessarily a perfect one-to-one match, but really in a population of this size, we're talking about, in our cross-sectional sample, we're talking about 20 million users. So even if, there are some bots or some sock puppets in there, the likelihood that bots or sock puppets are going to explain the trends that I'm going to show you is pretty unlikely, in our opinion. We don't believe that bots or sock puppets are going to skew these results in any substantial way. But again, we're working on some additional analyses to kind of tease this out a little bit more. And if you have suggestions on how to do this, and how to do this well, I'd be really interested in hearing them. How are we doing on time? Oh wow, okay. I'm gonna speed things up. So for our work, right, we're looking at specific societal events that are relevant to the queer community, that have impacts on the queer community. And for this sample, because we're looking at 2015 to 2018, we've kind of broken this down into 3 very broad categories. So the first are what we call inclusion and visibility events, right? These are events that are meant to promote positivity, visibility among the queer community. So things like Pride Month, National Coming Out Day, Trans Day of Visibility, Trans Day of Remembrance, those sorts of events. And then we're also looking at legal events. And for our sample, our big category that we look at is Obergefell v. Hodges, right? The decision that legalized same-sex marriage in the United States. Although we are looking into additional legal events to use. And again, if you have suggestions, feel free to let us know. And we are also looking at what we call anti-queer violent events. And our big case for this category was the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016, where a gay nightclub in Orlando was attacked by a homophobic individual. And so when we went into this, we kind of had 4 very broad hypotheses, right? The first being that, generally speaking, the prevalence of these words and these labels in individuals' Twitter biographies would be increasing over time. And that we are likely going to see more people adding these words into their profiles during positive events, so during inclusion and visibility events, and during positive legal decisions, which in our case meant immediately after the Obergefell v. Hodges decision. And then our other 2 hypotheses, this one dealing with violent events, right? In these cases, we expected to see more people making decisions to remove these words from their profile, right? Because people would likely feel pretty unsafe, existing as a queer individual after Pulse, or labeling themselves that way on Twitter. Although we kind of had a hunch, and or we thought that we would see potentially a delayed period of people adding these words to their profile. So we thought that we would see an initial spike in deletions, but then followed by people putting these words back into their profile as potentially some sort of showing of solidarity or support with the queer community following the Pulse shooting. And then lastly, right, we looked at a lot of visibility days corresponding to specific identities, right? So things like Trans Day of Visibility or Bi Day of Visibility, that sort of thing. We expected to see increases in the corresponding identity label following those specific days. So to get to the cool stuff, which is what we actually found. Can you guys see my cursor just so I can point to things? Okay, great. So this figure here, which is figure 1 in our paper, this comes from our longitudinal sample. So again, this is the sample of individuals where we're observing the same individuals at multiple points in time. And generally what we see, right, is a pretty large increase in these keywords, or people using these keywords in their bios. And this is all of the keywords put together. I'm going to show you in a second what the breakdown looks like for each individual word. But really, we can see from 2015, and this is measured in prevalence per 10,000, right? Just because the sheer scale of Twitter means that there are millions and millions of accounts. So we've magnified this a little bit. So this is about 30, I want to say like 34 in 10,000 accounts in 2015, versus in June of 2018, we see about 50 in 10,000. So these effects are fairly small. Just again, this is largely due to just the scale of Twitter being what it is. And you have a character limit of 160 characters in your bio, so not every person is going to include these words. But in our mind, right, that makes it even more salient when an individual chooses to do so, right? Because of all of the things you could put in your Twitter profile, or you could have chosen to put in your Twitter profile, you chose to label yourself as being queer, as a really salient part of you. So we're seeing an overall increase in about 47% from 2015 to 2018, which in our mind is a pretty large trend over time. And then again, just to break this down a little bit, this is again from our longitudinal sample. So these are the same individuals over time. And this is what the breakdown looks like for each individual label, or each individual category, right? So you can see here that certain words are increasing at a higher rate than others. They're really driving this trend. We see not very many increases in use of the word lesbian. Excuse me. So not very many increases in usage of the word lesbian, a very slight increase, or a slight increase in use of the word trans, a slight increase in use of the word bi, and a larger increase in use of the word gay and the word queer. So we're kind of interested in looking at why these different words might be changing at different rates, and looking at some additional categories that I'm not talking about in this talk, but we're also looking at some additional labels that might be driving this trend even further, that we didn't necessarily capture initially. So by and large, yes, we are seeing these words and usage of these labels increase over time. And this is also mirroring population trends in the United States, where the population of queer individuals has increased. I'm not remembering the exact percentage increase off the top of my head at the moment, but the population trends are also kind of mirroring this. And so this is, again, just the same data, but a little bit further. So this is data that we have that's including data from 2019 and 2020. And it's a little bit of a nicer graph here. So at the top here, you can see the keywords that we are using and the keywords that are captured with each of these different lines. So you see, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, transgender, and queer. And so this trend even starts to increase past 2018, right, into 2019 and 2020, and likely also into 2021. Although, as Jason mentioned, we didn't have the graphs ready for this talk. And it's interesting, right? You can see some words remain relatively flat, right? This is transgender and an abbreviation for the word lesbian, right? These words remain relatively flat. And usage of the word lesbian itself also remains relatively flat through 2020. But words like trans have increased slightly, queer has increased slightly, bi has increased, although we do see this very interesting dip in 2016 and 2017 that we can't necessarily explain because we don't really see other words dipping in the same way. And the word gay and the word queer have also increased. So all of these trends are increasing. Very broadly is the TLDR on that one, but we have a lot of interesting data that we can look at and are continuing to look at to tease apart exactly, which labels are increasing at different rates. Okay, so here's where we start to get into like specific societal events and how these events are impacting this trend. And this is a little bit of a noisy graph here, and so I'm gonna kind of walk you through this a little bit. Oh geez, my Zoom is making it hard to actually see the graph on my screen. But essentially, right, these are where we start looking at add and delete events, right? When people are choosing to add these words to their profile and delete them. And you can kind of see here, right, we have the date at the bottom and the counts of the number of accounts that contain, or sorry, these aren't number of accounts, these are number of additions and deletions, right? So the orange line here is our add events trend line. So these are the number of add events that we see on each of these specific days. And the number of delete events is the blue. So these are the number of times where we see individuals removing these words from their category, from their Twitter bio. And so, right, we see a couple of pretty distinct peaks in ad events, and I will show you another figure in a second that makes this a little bit more pronounced. But right about here is June of 2016, and we see a pretty large spike in additions, right? In June of 2016, and also June of 2017 is about here, which is a little bit of a lower peak, but still a pretty distinct peak nonetheless. And we did run some significance numbers on these in the paper, and these are actually significant trends. We did not observe any significant change in June of 2015, which I don't believe is captured on this figure here. But we did not see a change around Obergefell v. Hodges. What we did see that we didn't expect was our biggest peak in additions was right about here, which is immediately following. It's November of 2016, which is, I'm sure everyone remembers very clearly, right? That was right around the 2016 election. And we are still kind of speculating as to why that might be, right? We didn't necessarily expect to see a peak during the election, but we think it's really interesting that we did. So again, if anyone has ideas as to why that could be, we are still speculating and thinking about why this could be. So very interested to hear what you all might have to say. And this is just a figure that's essentially showing you the Pride Month trends, but a little bit differently, right? So these are the distribution of z-scores. So again, you imagine baseline is 0, and this is looking at the number of additions and deletions as z-scores. And so we can see here, right, these are the dates that are not in June, and we don't necessarily see a big difference between the number of people adding the word from their or adding the word to their profile and removing the word from their profile. But when we get to dates that are in June, right, June 2016, 2017, 2018, there is a pretty large increase in the number of people adding these words from their profile. And the number of people removing them hasn't necessarily changed very much. So we do see a big spike in people making decisions to label themselves as queer in their Twitter profile during Pride Month. And then just to, how am I doing on time? All right. I think we want about 15 minutes for Q&A. Is that right? All right. I'll try to speed things along so we have plenty of time. And so this is when we're looking at the Pulse nightclub shooting, right? So this black line right here in the middle of this figure is June 12th, 2016, when the Pulse shooting happened. And this is looking at these are again this line is looking at z-scores, right, from the baseline, and this is looking at the number of addition events and deletion events, and we see a pretty, I don't know, we see a pretty big, we see an uptick in both actually, which we didn't necessarily expect. So we see more people right about here in sorry, I'm losing my words a little bit, but so we do see a slight spike in deletions following pulse, but we also it doesn't necessarily stray too far from the baseline, but we also see a little bit of a spike in deletions, which was happening, or in additions, I'm sorry, which was happening before pulse happened and didn't necessarily go down too much after pulse. So this is, you know, probably just the general Pride Month effect that I was just talking about earlier, but we didn't necessarily see the huge spike in people removing these labels from their Twitter profile that we expected to see. So just to kind of wrap things up and speed through this so we can get to questions and discussion, right? So we do see that the prevalence of users who are using these words in their profile is increasing over time. And we do see some evidence of the impact of events that are meant to promote visibility and inclusion, right? We see the Pride Month effect, but we did not see any significant change around the Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015. And we also didn't really see any significant effects around individual visibility days, right? So we didn't necessarily see a big jump in the increase or in the use of the word trans around trans day of visibility and that sort of thing. We didn't really see any significant trends there. And so when we were looking at Pulse, right, we didn't necessarily see the huge spike in deletions that we expected to see. There was some change around using the keyword gay, and I should have mentioned this, I apologize, but this figure is actually specifically looking at the keyword gay in Twitter profiles. So just to go back slightly, this graph here, this is using at the, this is looking at specifically the use of the word gay, right? Since Pulse was very significant for gay men in particular, since it was a nightclub for gay men. And so just to kind of wrap things up, right? We're really excited about this. We've been working on developing this for a while now, right? And we can really get daily resolution data of not just queer visibility online, but we can really do this kind of work or this kind of analysis for any keyword we want, essentially, right? Any sort of label that you would want to look at in someone's profile, right? We are able to use these methods to do that and to get that data. But in terms of queer visibility specifically, right, we have a lot of precision here. We have a lot of scale here to really study this in depth that hasn't necessarily been done in a meaningful way before. And we do see a large increase in prevalence over time, and to us this really suggests that individuals are increasingly using these labels, increasingly feeling comfortable using these labels online, increasingly feeling safe identifying in this way, in not just on Twitter but potentially on other platforms as well, although we don't have the data on that yet. And, again, we don't see a lot of evidence for identity-specific visibility days. I should have said, I meant to write identity there instead of keyword. That was my bad. It would not be me giving a presentation if there wasn't a typo on one of the slides. But so we don't necessarily see evidence for any increases around identity-specific visibility days. But the big trend around Pride Month to us, and also the election, although we still don't necessarily have a good explanation of that trend yet, but this does suggest that societal events and offline factors are having some effect on individuals' decisions around self-presentation online, right? And specifically how individuals choose to label themselves on a very public platform like Twitter. And, in our mind, right, the increase in the use of these words and the use of these identifiers online around Pride Month, right, to some extent suggests that Pride Month is having its intended effect, right? It's making individuals feel, prouder. It makes individuals feel safer, more comfortable, expressing their queerness online, labeling themselves as LGBTQ online. So, in our mind, this is a positive thing, right? It means Pride Month is essentially doing its job, at least in this context. So again, just to kind of speculate where we could go with this, right? We, can study potentially whether these trends are happening outside of the US, right? In international samples of Twitter users, since we focus specifically on Americans here. We could look at other identifiers, other labels that people are using online. One category that we are looking at or starting to look at in another project is looking at pronoun usage, right? Individuals putting their pronouns publicly in their Twitter profile. Is that trend becoming more common, or the use of those words becoming more common? We're also looking at, are there potentially other events that might impact one's decision to use an LGBTQ label in their Twitter profile? And we're also, interested in looking at the anomaly around 2016, right? Why was that so significant? What else could have been happening there? That sort of thing. And again, Jason mentioned we have more recent data now, so we are, exploring 2021, 2020, 2019, and looking at whether these trends are persisting past 2018 as well. All right, so I talked for a while. That's really all I have for you. And, Jason and I are both here. We can both answer any questions that you have. Really excited to hear your feedback.
Thank you very much.
All right, how do we want to do this? I think I saw, I guess, do you want me to just call on people or?
Yeah, you're in charge. Go for it.
Okay, so I saw Nick's hand first.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this fascinating and incredibly rich talk. I guess I have one question that's specific to measurement here, which is, what about emojis? Aren't rainbow emojis a thing that make it a lot easier to signify identity with with fewer characters? And then second, I'd like to know a little bit more about how these descriptions cluster in two ways. So when I'm thinking about your election of Donald Trump puzzle here, I wonder if part of what's going on is a kind of strategic signaling related to other aspects of somebody's identity. So in other words, somebody's political identity or identification could kind of drag a self-identification as gay or bi or trans into the public in a new way. So the way I can think of to kind of get at this is to look at the extent to which these add deletes are clustering across different identifiers, identifying words. And then the second piece, and I'm really glad to see you thinking of expanding this internationally, because the second piece of clustering that I think might be relevant here is spatial. So in the United States, there are somewhat notoriously safer and less safe places to explicitly identify oneself as being gay. I can imagine, for example, with the Pulse nightclub shooting, that if you're in, it was Miami, right? Is that correct? If you're in Miami, you are going to, there are probably going to be very different identity dynamics than if you're in New York City or the Castro in San Francisco or something like that. And so my thought here is, well, what about using location identifiers as well as at least an interaction on these effects? So those are my two thoughts.
Yeah, great. Sorry, I'm just writing down what you said so I can answer that. But in terms of your first question about emojis, it's something we're working on, right? We didn't necessarily look at emojis for this data set just because emojis are it's harder to capture just in terms of scripting, and Jason can probably talk a lot more about how hard this is to do. But emojis are definitely something we're looking at, and we are incorporating into this because you're right, rainbow emojis, pride flag emojis, all of those things are really easy to study. So we're working on getting data for emojis specifically. And then in terms of clustering, sorry, I'm just gathering my thoughts. The lack of caffeine this morning is really catching up to me. But so I think you're right that different locations have different trends, different ways of identifying oneself. Specifically about Miami and Pulse, we didn't necessarily look at location clustering explicitly yet, and that was mainly because we already had a lot to pack into this one paper. So we were looking at, we were already running up against, a lot of things to put in and not a lot of space to talk about it. But now that we are essentially, what we're doing is we're essentially splitting, we're kind of expanding this and looking at doing some additional work on this. So looking at location clustering might, is a really excellent idea. But I don't have those answers for you right now. But yeah, it's certainly a great thought. Okay, I saw Raf and then Owen.
Fantastic talk. It's so cool. You've been working on this so long. It's so cool to see it come to fruition. I have a question, like a theoretical question. I was wondering about the bearing of this work on sociology of networks. Like going back to Goffman, we know that people who are in stigmatized groups will often disclose to people who are sympathetic to people in those groups. Sarah Cowan's work on the sociology of secrets has really borne this out, that like if you have an abortion, you're more likely to disclose to people who are like okay with that. You're not going to tell people who would be, show disdain for you or something like that. Twitter is very echo chamber like, right? If you're like a right-wing Long Islander, your social reality on Twitter is going to be, Long Islander tweets and Alex Jones stuff or whatever. How does like the like network aspect of Twitter bear upon the stuff your results, I guess?
Yeah, I think again, we weren't necessarily coming at this from a networks perspective explicitly, but I think you're right that queer individuals are likely to have a lot of queer friends, and so if you there's definitely a network aspect to this, but for this project, we were really more interested in overall population trends rather than looking at networks explicitly, and that was really because we were interested in visibility, right? We're interested in visibility. We're interested in whether, just very broadly speaking, the use of these identifiers are becoming more visible and public, right? And so we weren't necessarily considering networks, much like the location clustering, right? That would also be a network aspect of this, where individuals in certain locations would cluster together, individuals in certain networks would cluster together. But I think that, and there's been some work on, you mentioned the work on abortions. There's also been work on other, disclosures of that nature. But but yeah, I think networks would play a large role in this, especially when when you deal with location networks. when you deal with, potentially, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought again, but yeah, I think you're I think you're absolutely right. But it's not, the network aspect is not necessarily something that we captured here, because we are, again, interested in looking at, broader population trends. Jason, I don't know if you have anything more you want to add on that.
I'll just say that both emojis and locations are two things that weren't done in this first round just because of friction, right? It's just a little bit technologically harder to deal with emojis. You got to keep your encoding consistent across many different, steps in the pipeline. And the location stuff, I have many grant proposals in to get both finer grained location, geographical location, precision, and going wider, right, going internationally. And the networks, the friction there is that Twitter won't give you the network, right? That's something that they guard very closely, right? The social connection network is very rate limited in the API. And there are ways that I want to work around that, but you'll never have the full network. And you certainly won't have the daily snapshot of the full network, which we would like to have. But we can sample it, and some of that is in the pipeline too.
Yeah, the other thing that makes it a little bit more challenging to do location analysis specifically is that for this sample, and part of why we cut this off at 2018 is because prior to 2018, Twitter would give you time zone data with a snapshot of someone's profile, which is how we narrowed this down to Americans. And past 2018, GDPR means that Twitter doesn't do that anymore. So we don't have time zone data for the user anymore. So the only way that we can measure someone's location is to actually look at what they have written in the location field, which is not necessarily going to be where someone actually is, right? You can write Westeros in your location field on Twitter. And that sort of thing. So we're going to, obviously not capture everybody in a particular location. So data hurdles and privacy hurdles that we are, trying to figure out how to compensate for in this talk. All right, so we have about 5 minutes. I think we have time for one more question, and I think I saw Owen's hand for a long time.
Yes, hi, thanks for the very interesting talk. Just wanted to mention, I have been meeting for a long time to organize a meeting of people working on Twitter on campus. There are people on political science, sociology, linguistics, and computer science. So if you're interested, send me email, owen.rambo@stonybrook. My question is about anonymity. You didn't really talk about anonymity, and Twitter, in contrast, of course, with Facebook famously, does allow anonymity, whereas Facebook, you're not supposed to be anonymous. And I guess LinkedIn also, there's, it's a professional network, there's no point in being anonymous. And I, for example, have 2 Twitter accounts, and one is professional, which is my name, and the other is personal, which is anonymous. And so so that relates both to the sock puppet question and to the issue of fear of offline repercussions. So I wonder whether it would be interesting to analyze the Twitter handles to determine whether they look like they might be anonymous. Someone like San Francisco Otter, well, that would be anonymous, whereas Owen.Rambo, probably not anonymous, even though it might be a fake name. And I wonder whether factoring in the Twitter handle might be interesting, with the hypothesis being that the more anonymous, the more use of self-identifiers would be found.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And, we know from work on, other types of disclosures involving, stigmatized information or stigmatized identities that, anonymous or anonymity does make it more likely for someone to talk about these kinds of things online, right? Disclose these kinds of things online. Some of the work that I mentioned previously, right, looks very explicitly at anonymity, and they were, I believe, focusing on Reddit and looking at how an anonymity on Reddit made it more likely to disclose a stigmatized identity. And I'm not remembering exactly what the disclosure was off the top of my head, but that work has definitely been done. And so we know that anonymity does influence this. And I think you're right. You know, I mean, I also have 2 Twitter accounts, right? One of which is professional that I don't necessarily use a lot, but also the other one that, you know, I talk about Star Wars and you know, video games on, and don't necessarily associate with my work life. And so the idea of using the Twitter handle as a measure of anonymity is interesting, because, you know, I think that it would potentially be a decent enough classifier, but it also wouldn't be perfect, right? There's really just no, like, there's no perfect, it's just like there's no perfect measurement of how to identify if someone's a bot or if someone is a sock puppet, right? There's no perfect measurement of anonymity, right? There's no real way to get at whether someone is being anonymous. So we didn't necessarily, again, do that specifically for this sample, because there's really just no way to know. And we're still trying to figure out exactly how to tease that apart.
A colleague of mine has developed a Twitter handle parser that extracts information from the handles. So there might be a low-hanging experiment here just to see if there's some correlation, if you're interested in that, just to mention that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we can definitely do, just as a kind of thought exercise, definitely. But I don't know that it would be, you know, I don't know that using the Twitter handle as a measure of anonymity would necessarily be a perfect classifier, but it's certainly something that we can explore and look into. And I think just looking at my phone, we have just exactly hit 1 o'clock. So, yeah, I mean, this was really great. Thank you all for your questions and feedback. And, you know, both of our email addresses are right here on the slide. You can always email us if you have, you know, more thoughts or questions, or if you want to hear more about this. Happy to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Irissa. Much enjoyed it. I'll email you my question. That's good.
Yeah, definitely.